Greetings. I'm Angelica Fenner, cross-appointed faculty in German and Cinema Studies here at the University of Toronto. In what follows, I'll be offering a cursory glimpse into some of what I've been up to during a 6-month faculty fellowship that took place in fall 2024. In that context, I wish to first acknowledge the JHI's director, Dr. Alison Keith, along with all the staff at the Institute for everything they do on behalf of the humanities. I'd also like to thank the sponsors who continue to make possible the Institute's extraordinary programming on our campus. What I'll be elaborating here poses an offshoot from a larger SSHRC-funded research agenda that entails a co-authored book with colleague Dr. Hester Baer of the University of Maryland. That project focuses on a lesser explored chapter of West German feminist film history retracing to the 1960s. We've been exploring a unique institutional setting that served as a veritable incubator for some of the ensuing social interventions among feminist filmmakers in the 70s. This institutional setting was the Ulm School of Design, founded in 1953 as successor to the Bauhaus School, which had shuttered its doors in 1933 in response to the rise of National Socialism. In 1962, the Ulm School established a film division, which became the first site in the Federal Republic to offer formal training in the technical skills of camera operation, sound recording, editing, and scripting. The film division accepted applications from young people with widely disparate backgrounds, many of them with an uneven and disrupted education as a result of war, displacement, and the need to assist their families' economic survival. Applicants were assessed on the basis of experience, innovative thinking, and creative potential. They included international students and those lacking a high school degree, and also young women inspired by contemporary new wave impulses and eager to learn a craft traditionally not available to them. The film department's radical vision, however, proved short-lived, as the Ulm School was compelled to shut down in 1968 amid generational and political disagreements waging both within the school and with state and local authorities. Of particular interest to us is the fact that among those 3 film graduates who went on to make films, both commercially and for television, and who also settled into careers teaching film, all of them actually happened to be women, each hailing from disparate backgrounds and each contributing in distinctive ways to the ensuing West German feminist film movement. During the JHI Fellowship, I stepped aside from this larger project to devote closer attention to one of these directors, namely Claudia von Alemann, and more specifically her most successful fiction feature film, Die Reise nach Lyon, The Journey to Lyon, which was remastered by the Deutsche Kinemathek in 2021. If names can become destiny, there's no lack of irony in the English title assigned this film. After being widely hailed in the French and German reception upon its release in 1981, it was forced into a veritable blind spot within film history's onward narrative trajectory, as a result of a Kodachrome film stock flaw that impacted filmmakers worldwide, including Alemann's heavily circulated 16mm copies. In a scenario not untypical during a decade characterized by curtailment of the generous subsidies that had once enabled the flourishing new German cinema, von Alemann couldn't afford to have new film copies reissued from the original 35mm print. Thus, although the film was significant enough in its era of release to find its way into the canon of standard textbooks of German film history, it has yet to be subject to in-depth scholarly analysis. Scholars of feminist film theory and women's film history have elaborated extensively on the ideological significance of the absence of women directors in film historiography, an absence compounded by the loss of old film prints due to lack of resources to preserve them and of space for their existence in archives. My investigation was motivated by a desire to consolidate information about this film's production and contextualize its significance. I was especially concerned to prioritize engagement with von Alemann herself as historical eyewitness to a project staged half a century earlier. In conversations, she had reminisced about the circumstances under which the film was produced, and I grew fascinated to understand how this shaped the film's innovative aesthetics. I chose to venture overseas on my own journey to Lyon, which opened me not only to new ways of engaging with film, but also a new way of writing about it. In past, I had always limited myself to understanding a film's textuality, social context, and production history at a remove that was not only socio-historical, but also, in the most fundamental sense, material. Traveling to Lyon and revisiting film locations brought into play what felt like an entirely new array of both analytical vectors and sensory motor responses. Von Alemann had played a significant role in launching the West German feminist film movement, organizing with Helke Sander the first International Women's Film Seminar. This took place in 1973 at the Arsenal Cinema in Berlin as a forum for screening and discussing women's films from around the world. In the course of that same decade, she shot multiple documentaries for television relating to women's history and to activism among populations seeking emancipation through decolonization. This entailed travel to Algiers, Montreal, Namibia, Toronto, and Vietnam. Yet whereas much of that work has been issue-oriented and motivated by the direct cinema imperative to capture history in the making, Die Reise nach Lyon became her first fiction feature, one centering its female protagonist as embodied witness to history in a manner not unlike the features of other feminist directors released during that same conjuncture. I include here a few notable examples. Von Alemann gained inspiration for this project after stumbling in a bookstore upon a copy of a travel journal of 19th century pre-socialist feminist author and essayist Flora Tristan. Published posthumously in 1973, Le Tour de France both added to Tristan's sizable oeuvre printed during her lifetime, yet also posed a contemporary intervention within the 1970s, a decade characterized by the repair of historiographical blind spots that had resulted from centuries of occluding women's authorship and contributions, whether literary, social, political, or scientific. Even journals, epistolary correspondences, and other seemingly non-literary documents can offer a more nuanced understanding of, or even challenge and complicate, official records, thereby prompting reconsideration of dominant historical narratives. Alemann was particularly fascinated by Tristan's impassioned accounts of the triumphs and tribulations she encountered as a woman committed to social activism and gender emancipation, circumstances with which Alemann also strongly identified. She thereupon secured funding for a feature film that centers a fictional historian, Elisabeth, who journeys from Frankfurt to Lyon to retrace architectural structures, streets, and settings Tristan previously inhabited just months prior to her early death in Bordeaux from what biographers speculate was typhoid. Elisabeth's first-person voiceover, her inner monologue in the film story, reads aloud both excerpts from Tristan's journal entries as well as from her own fictionalized travel diary, the two seamlessly alternating to the point where not only Elisabeth's but our own identifications become blurred between the two historical layers of protagonists. As spectators, we witness not solely one woman's quest to retrace the footsteps of a 19th century French-Peruvian feminist, but also that enactment as lived realization of the film director's own personal quest. At the same time, during my own travels, I came to realize that in feeling compelled to actually revisit the film locations, my researches and writing were inscribing yet a further layer into a mise en abîme of women's quests within the same geographical setting, yet enacted across the span of nearly 2 centuries. Upon arrival in the city, I undertook frame grabs from key settings identifiable in the film and searched these out during my urban walks, taking photos in an effort to crudely replicate via my iPhone the sightlines once captured by cinematographer Hilla Sagel. I revisited the 16th century Hotel Le Phoenix along the banks of the Rhône, where the protagonist Elisabeth rents a room in 1981, and I crossed that river's nearby passerelle, which would have already existed in Tristan's lifetime, and which Elisabeth is seen crossing several times during the film. I located the restaurant where Elizabeth had eaten her meals among local card-playing patrons. I followed the labyrinth of covered passageways and countless winding stairs of the Traboules, hidden passageways built into the slopes of the Croix Hill, where Elizabeth walks with her tape recorder, documenting the sounds emanating from open windows facing into the courtyards. I visited a museum dedicated to the history of silk weaving, witnessing museum staff reenact the painstaking labors that 18th and 19th century weavers undertook across 12-hour workdays, using clattering looms that occupied most of their own cramped living quarters and that necessitated high ceilings and tall windows to gain as much daylight as possible for this intricate work. I spent 2 weeks alternating between wearing my Birkenstocks and my more comfortable rubber-soled Echo sneakers as I walked Lyon's cobblestone streets. In Elizabeth's voiceover diary entries, layered onto a shot of her walking barefoot with shoes in hand, she recalls Tristan lamenting in her own diary how tired and bruised her feet felt after walking on cobblestones. As von Alemann's proxy, Elizabeth travels from her fictionalized post in Frankfurt to grasp firsthand the material conditions of Tristan's life, as outlined in her travel journal, Le Tour de France. In this, she pursues a form of historical materialism that philosopher Walter Benjamin also promulgated, one that, quote, recites events without distinguishing between major and minor acts, unquote, and which may glimpse something from the past as, quote, an image which flashes up at the instant when it can be recognized and is never seen again, unquote. Benjamin was critiquing an inherited version of historicism that perceives time as homogeneous, linear, and culminating in a universal history of the way it really was. Benjamin instead defines the historical materialist as one who, quote, cannot do without the notion of a present, which is not a transition, but in which time stands still and has come to a stop. For this notion defines the present in which he himself is writing history. Historicism gives the eternal image of the past. Historical materialism supplies a unique experience with the past. Benjamin's argument has been applied in feminist historiographies, such as that of Jane Gaines and of Monica Dall'Asta, empowering scholars to acknowledge the ways that artifactual access to the past can spark recognition, empathy, and understanding precisely because it resonates with an individual's present conditions and experiences. It's this intersection between past and present, when filtered through a phenomenological lens, that also inspired me to incorporate an autotheoretical mode as a means to work through the insights precipitated. Those findings and their implications seem to best lend themselves to a voice blending first-person reflection, textual analysis, and side historical contextualization. This enabled me to articulate the intertextual identifications that I found myself forging with the multiple layers of protagonists. Laurent Fournier coins this process intertextual intimacy, which, quote, denotes a tendency for those working autotheoretically to draw parallels between their own experiences and the experiences of others, using the similarity between their lives and other lives as the basis for choosing the examples they cite. Often, though not always, this intertextual identification, that moment of seeing oneself in another, of recognizing one's experience in a new way, coexists with the para-academic uses of citations and references as a way of acknowledging the source of knowledge or influence in one's work, unquote. Mind you, there will always be differences to account for, and identification may also include elements of misidentification. But when engaged in process-oriented scholarship, empirical exactitude is only one of several drivers. Needless to say, there's much more that could be elaborated about this project. I've only gestured here towards its trajectory, which has ultimately proved aleatory in the best possible sense, filled with serendipities and impelled by trusting my own hunches. I've benefited from input received at past conferences of the Film and Media Studies Canada Association and also of the Modern Language Association, which provided a forum for developing this autotheoretical component. And I'm grateful to be working with a wonderful university press to bring this manuscript to a wider audience. Thanks so much for dropping by. Please feel free to reach out to me with any questions or helpful comments.